All right, listeners, I think you know that we are part of the Radiotopia network, which is basically a network built on the idea that you should support the most creative, independent audio makers around. No one, and I mean no one, embodies the Radiotopia ethos more than Benjamin Walker and his show Theory of Everything. Benjamin, who I've known for a long time, has been making beautiful, personal, sprawling audio documentaries for decades that help us understand the very strange world we live in. And now he has a new series called Not All Propaganda is Art. The new series goes back to the 1950s when Western security agencies like the CIA paid artists, writers, and intellectuals to fight the cultural Cold War.
The CIA funds were free. I mean, no one was told what to say.
Gloria Steinem, activist who sees the CIA as a sort of enlightened pal or rich uncle, there is another viewpoint.
Look, if you're listening to this show, I know you like secret histories. I know you like a mix of culture and politics and shadowy figures. So what are you waiting for? Not All Propaganda is Art from Benjamin Walker. You can find it now wherever you listen or at theoryofeverythingpodcast.com. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. We're doing a bunch of special episodes in the run-up to the midterm elections, some theme weeks, and it is now polling week. A few conversations about polling, particularly as it relates to the midterm elections. You will laugh, you'll learn, you'll love. Let's do it. It is polling week, and who better to join us for this week than Harry Enten of CNN, our special guest, formerly of 538, a man for whom every week is polling week. Harry, welcome back to the show, buddy.
You know, I'm literally taking a poll right now amongst myself. It's a poll of one, figuring out what I'm going to eat for lunch. Chinese is out in front, but we'll see if Indian's able to come from behind.
Well, this is an interesting segue because today we are going to talk about a bit of a polling error and the polling pointing in one direction and then the result being in another. And so, you know, your lunch decision may very well reflect the 2010 Nevada Senate race. Before we get to that, let me introduce, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kelly Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
You want to talk about what you're thinking about having for lunch?
I had a colleague who brought me over, as people can tell I'm a little under the weather, brought me over some homemade soup, and I am digging back into that as soon as we're done recording.
Wonderful. Wonderful.
I need to do better. I've been skipping lunch, just like having coffee, because I've been working at my desk. So I've got to do better. Lunch is comes at 3 o'clock for me.
Okay, yeah. So, look. Let's talk about polling. Our first episode for polling week, we asked Harry Enten kind of for some of his favorite polling and midterm stories. And the first one that he mentioned was we have to talk about the 2010 Nevada Senate race. This is the race where Harry Reid, who was the majority leader in the Senate, was trailing in the polls to Republican challenger Sharron Angle. But that all changed on Election Day. So Harry Enten, aside from the fact that this is just a chance to talk about another Harry, and I know there's a lot of Harry solidarity out there. Why did you want to start with this story?
I think the reason I wanted to start with it, because when you say historic polling misses and elections where I was just floored on election night, I remember I was in my college dorm room and every single public poll had Harry Reid ahead. I'm looking right now, polling average had Sharron Angle up by 3 points. There wasn't a public poll, I think, in the final 3 weeks of the campaign that had Harry Reid out in front. And I just recall being so surprised. And, general elections are a different ball game than primaries. When you have a primary polling miss, you can be, surprised. But, when there's no party ID for people to go off of, no partisan queue, that things can change very rapidly in the final few days of the campaign. But this was an example where the polling was just wrong pretty much the entire way. And it was one of these great examples in my mind of polling being a tool, not being a Nostradamus, if you will. Mm-hmm. So when you asked me, this was the first one that kind of just jumped because I just remember being so surprised.
And normally we wouldn't think of Harry Reid as someone at risk in a race. Yeah. He had dominated in Nevada for such a long time. But of course, this was 2010 when there was a real Republican surge that would become a Republican shellacking, in the words of Barack Obama. But I think that Reid in many ways was underestimated. And because he had so much on the ground support that he had cultivated over decades, it didn't necessarily show up in the polling.
Yeah. But I also think that there was an idea that because he had held on to this seat for so long, that people might have wanted a change. The Tea Party definitely had a moment. And when we think about, Sharron Angle, I mean, she comes in as a Tea Party candidate, really, and is trying to mix it up and be a new face for the state.
Yeah. Well, that to me, though, is interesting because, I mean, I feel like polling, is the very thing that's supposed to guard against that, right? The narrative that, oh, he's been around for a long time and, oh, it's a Tea Party year and, oh, there's this fresh face and this desire for a fresh, and then often it's the polling that comes along and gives the reality check of, well, wait a minute, he's still an incumbent, he's still beloved, and the polls show him ahead. And so this is an interesting inversion of that in a sense. But Harry, what do you think?
I think a few things. Number one, it's so weird to think back 12 years ago where the polling miss actually benefited Democrats. That is, the Democrat outperformed what the polling said. Now, of course, after 2016 and to a lesser extent 2020, we're all kind of in this looking around, people in my profession, will the polls underestimate Republicans yet again? But in 2010, at least in Nevada, that wasn't the case. In 2012, nationally, that wasn't the case. Barack Obama was underestimated. The other thing, that I'll just note when I sort of think back on that race and I think of how difficult polling can be, it was discussed a little bit earlier on in the conversation how basically Nevada is just such a weird place where there is a large culinary union that has a lot of power in Las Vegas, and how the workers' schedules in that state are very different than they are in a lot of other states, right? People are off during the day and they work at night on the Strip. And this makes a pollster's job very, very difficult. And if you don't know how to poll those culinary workers, you could, in fact, be underestimating Democrats because by and large and full, they are, in fact, Democrats. And that seemed to be the case, at least in 2010.
Yeah, the Reid camp pointed to a landline bias in some of the public polls, and meaning that maybe, it was harder to reach some of these workers that you're referring to. There was potential undercounting of Hispanic support. And those are all things that kind of maybe are things that are going now into the dynamic you described of undercounting maybe Republicans in some states. But here, those same forces maybe were working towards undercounting or not seeing Democrats.
Yeah, I mean, now everyone has a cell phone, and if you're not, if you're a pollster who isn't calling cell phones, you're in big trouble. If you're going to be calling people on the phone, obviously you could do online polls, whatever. But
what is a landline?
Well, you pound that button on the thing. It has a cord attached. We get a rotary phone in here. But back then, we were basically, coming at this point where cell phones were going to be overtaking landlines. And there were still, in fact, plenty of pollsters who were not trying to get at the cell phone only population. And you mentioned, the polling errors now, Jody, and I just sort of think there are always potential ways for pollsters to miss out on folks, right? It could be that we're simply not calling them. It could be that they're not picking up even when we are calling them. It could be, in some cases, maybe they're not being honest with pollsters, though I tend to think that is a little bit stretched out. I don't think that's necessarily the case. But it's just a reminder, again, of how difficult the job of polling truly is to get down to that pinpoint level. And we really should be looking to polls to get us in the right neighborhood, right? Oh, this is a close race. It could go either way, or it's a blowout race. But once you're within a few points, as we were in the case of Nevada 2010, you really shouldn't be expecting too much. You should just be expecting a close race, which it ultimately was, though Harry Reid still won it by about 6 points.
Harry, I agree that people don't tend to lie to pollsters that much, but there does seem to have been in the last 5 years or so a kind of identity-based resistance to answering polls on the right, and a kind of pride in pollsters missing because they're not polling conservatives and conservatives not responding to pollsters when they call. Does that play a role at all, or is that just a narrative that doesn't have a lot of support in the data?
When we're talking about modern poll misses, it's kind of hard to figure out why exactly a poll may be off when you can't get the people to answer a poll who are the ones who aren't answering all the public polls, right? But I do think there is one fun little nugget in the data that potentially gives us sort of an insight that there are, in fact, some people who aren't answering polls. And that is essentially if you ask people what their race is, right? Everyone knows pretty much what their race is. Some people might be white, some people might be black, some people might be mixed race, biracial, what have you. And if you look at that number, there are, in fact, a number of people who refuse to give an answer to that question. And those people were far more likely to support Donald Trump than Joe Biden. And that's a very weird thing because we sort of look back and my memory is that, in fact, there really wasn't that bias back in the day where basically the people who refused to answer the race question pretty much split the way that everybody else split. But now all of a sudden, if you have a particular part of the population that's not answering that based on ideology, that can mess things up. So there are a lot of reasons why polls may potentially be misfiring, but there does seem to be some support that the people who are supporting Republican candidates, even if they are taking the polls, may be less likely to answer particular questions within a given poll.
That's really fascinating.
I wonder how much polls are swayed by debates or swayed by certainly like scandals or nuggets that will drop like a week or two before the election happens. I think of this election with Reid and how they have the debate and, Angle sort of going at him. And during the debate, she tells him to man up. And I was like, oh, shots fired. One, because, she's this woman telling him to man up. Two, also because, he was a former boxer. So the idea of like literally hitting him below the belt is something that she's trying to do in talking about policy. I think they were talking about Social Security or something like that. But did those little punches, those little hits have an impact on polling like before or after there's a debate or something that happens close to an election?
So I think of two different ways of thinking about that question. Number one, moments that actually really did impact the outcome in a debate. So Richard Murdoch in 2012 in Indiana, when he was discussing rape, that was a moment in which, that was a Republican seat. Remember, Murdoch beat Dick Lugar, who was the longtime, more moderate senator. He beat him from the right in that Republican primary. And then sure enough, Joe Donnelly was easily able to defeat Richard Murdoch. And you could see the turning point in the polls being that debate moment. So that's one way. The other way is when it's sort of a mirage. So sometimes after a debate, one person or one candidate will be crowned as sort of the winner, and it will deflate the other side. And all of a sudden, they're not answering polls to nearly the same degree. We saw that to some extent in 2016 with Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, when Clinton was, by and large part, declared the winner by the media. And all of a sudden, Republicans were less likely to answer the polls. The further you got out from the debate, all of a sudden, it seemed like Trump was coming back. But in reality, and a lot of that was just Republicans less likely to answer the polls in the first place. So it can go either way.
We are sort of framing this in the run-up to the midterms. Is there a dynamic here and a difference between midterms and general elections? I mean, my general understanding is that, midterms are so diffuse, they're spread out all over the place. The voters are paying less attention, that maybe that one debate moment is going to have less of a sort of swing hinge point impact than maybe something on a presidential level.
I think there are a few things. One, I think more people are paying attention to Senate races in a midterm year than Senate races in a presidential year, because it's, the top of the ballot along with the gubernatorial races. Two is, if you look back over the last two presidential cycles, we've had near 70 or so Senate races. In only one state did the candidate who won the Senate race differ from the candidate who won the presidential race. That was Maine in 2020, with Susan Collins winning there rather easily over Sarah Gideon, while Joe Biden was easily able to triumph over Donald Trump. Versus in 2018, there were a number of red state Democratic incumbents who were in fact able to win. There were some that didn't, Heidi Heitkamp, for example, Claire McCaskill, Missouri, but, Joe Manchin in West Virginia was able to triumph. John Tester in Montana was able to triumph. So there may be a little less going along with the way you feel about the president. So there perhaps is a little bit more room for movement, but the sample size is kind of small. So in this partisan era, so I don't want to jump to too many conclusions, but I do think it's at least an interesting statistical anecdote.
As we wrap up, coming back to this 2010 race between Reid and Angle, there's a couple things I want to touch on. Well, one, Nikki, you sort of hinted at this, like, the trolling of the the trolling of pollsters, and Reid did a little bit of this in the wake of this. I mean, he had a quote where he said, we've got to do something about these misleading polls all over the country. They're so unfair, and people just gobble them up and run with them like they're the finest pastry in the world. I told people for weeks that I was comfortable where I was. Harry, is that just sort of like, it's a tried and true tradition for anyone who beats the polls to crow about it? Or what do you make of that?
People just love to beat on polls, whether they're losing, whether they're winning. It's an easy thing to go after because, there are going to be plenty of examples, especially in an era in which elections are so close, in which the polls are going to be wrong. Whether or not the polls really impact the outcome. Look, I don't think in elections in which you have a Republican and a Democratic candidate that polls will really influence things because you're either a Democrat or Republican, very few swing voters, and those voters are not paying attention to the polls. Yeah. In primaries, it's a very different ballgame, right, in which you can have candidates who are similarly ideologically aligned, and you may choose one conservative instead of the other because the polls show that conservative that you ultimately choose has a better chance of winning. But by large in part, I think that people are a little too harsh on the polls. I think it's pretty cool that, you can call 300, 400, 500, upwards of 1,000 or more people and get a very good idea of what's going to happen. It's like magic. And I wish that people sort of saw it as sort of this amazing scientific or social science achievement instead of seeing, the poll was off 4 points. Oh, my God, the poll was off by only 4 is the way I would sort of say.
Well, we're gonna get into some of that history of that magic in the next episode or two. But then one last thing here. I mean, to maybe bring it to now. Well, I should say in that 2010 election, our mutual pal Nate Silver, he got 34 out of 37 elections for U.S. Senate. That the model was on the correct side of the result there. Nevada was one of the ones where it was quote unquote wrong. To remind people the number, Reid was trailing by about 3, ended up winning by about 5. So 7, 8 point swing. I'm not going to ask you to make predictions, Harry, other than in a more generic way. What is your sense of, like, this fall? Will there be some election that does that is kind of like 7, 8 points of a swing in one direction or the other?
It very well could be the case. I mean, and the thing about, at this moment, as we're sitting here and you look at sort of the states that will determine Senate control, what's interesting is that there are pretty much in all parts of the country, right? You have a race in Pennsylvania, you have a race in Georgia, you have a race in Nevada. These are states where, if the polling is off in one region, but it may not be off in the others, there's a pretty good shot we'll hit one of those regions because we have swing states in very different parts. And Nevada this year has a very tight Senate race between Mastow, Catherine Cortez Mastow, and Adam Laxalt. So this could be another example of the polls missing. I will note that the polls more recently in Nevada in 2020, any event, I believe, underestimated Donald Trump. But in 2018, they underestimated Jackie Rosen, I believe, if I recall correctly. So I don't know which way it's going to go, but it's just kind of interesting as somebody who takes a look at this, where it's a fun time because there's still a lot to be determined.
Yeah, and the one other thing I'll say that I learned at 538, and it was important to keep in mind, is that, a polling miss, we pay attention to the ones that miss across the winner divide, right? But often there's like a 7-point, 8-point polling miss that just makes a race closer, but the person who was ahead by less, or the person who was ahead by a little won by more. And those are just as important to look at. And we always focus on the one that crosses that divide and flips the winner. But, when you're thinking about kind of accuracy of polling, it's an important thing to keep in mind.
I would just quickly note, and I don't want to hog too much of the time here, that in 2014, Mark Warner seemed to be up by near 10 points. And then on election night, Ed Gillespie, the Republican in Virginia, was leading for most of the night, and Warner won by, about a point or a little bit less than that. And people don't remember that, but that's a warning sign that sometimes there really will be a shocker. 95% of the time, the polls will be pretty gosh darn good, but that 5% of the time, oh boy.
Right. Yeah. All right. Well, last thing I'll say is, we've really hit the two words in our world that are very disputed in terms of pronunciation. So we've been saying Nevada and Nevada, and we've been saying data and data. And so, I don't think we'll ever know how either of those are pronounced. I've just noted that we've said all four versions. So over the course of this conversation, Harry, do you have a strong opinion about Nevada data?
Not on data. I do know that one of the ways to pronounce the Silver State is correct, and if John Ralston, who's runs the Nevada Independent, is out there, he will certainly correct if I have it wrong. My apologies in advance to the great people out in that state with 6 electoral votes.
All right, there we go. Harry Enten of CNN, thank you for doing this, and you will be back for the rest of our Polling Week episodes. But thanks again, buddy.
Thank you.
And Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kelly Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Radiotopia.